So good morning. And I know most everyone here. I'm Deirdre Gavel, and again, I'm a member of Haddonfield monthly meeting here. And I think most everyone here is Quaker, or at least Quaker friendly, and I want to say welcome to Clarence, who joined us here. One of my family members. I think we all know what the talk's going to be about. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my own past and growing up in a very, very conservative Christian family. I call it a cult. And I call it that because basically that's what it was. There is a book going around. It's a comic book about one of my family relatives, technically a cousin of mine who informed my family's spirituality. And I'll get into a little bit more about that as the talk goes on. I'm going to be making the case that the current outrage against transgender people in particular, and more broadly against the entire LGBTQI community as a whole, is wrong, unbiblical, and indeed manufactured in order to sow political divisiveness among us. And indeed, the American population is being played. We have become pawns. We're being forced to take sides in an argument which should never have been an argument at all. Again, first I'm going to tell you about my own story, then I'll talk a bit about the biblical and religious arguments that have been directed against the LGBTQI community, and I'll discuss the presumed arguments from nature. Most often these come from those with religious positions, but sometimes they're carried by non-theists as well. And we'll look at political objections, where they come from, and then at the end we'll have time for questions and answers. Along the way, I'll be using some terms that hold particular meanings, but which can be confusing for some people, or which may need some clarification, and these I'll explain along the way. Some of what will be discussed might be triggering or disturbing, and if you need to take some time, if you need to do some grounding or whatever, we've got a little library outside. If you need to get out of the room, that's okay. Part of being in a cult is that there is abuse, and that can take many forms. That abuse also happens in society today, especially against the LGBTQI community. If you start feeling yourself getting angry during this presentation, some people might, that's okay too. I understand how you feel. I felt that way about myself for many years. I grew up in an environment where being LGBTQI was an abomination. I hated who I was. What I ask is that if you feel angry, rather than lashing out, look inward, formulate a question. What is it that's making you angry? Is it something in particular about a scripture? Is it a belief of yours that's being contradicted? When you identify that, please ask the question. But also, please be willing, even if you don't agree with the answer, to at least hear it. There might be disagreements. Many people disagree about doctrinal positions. That's why we have so many denominations of Christianity. But please, and this is important, let's not doubt each other's sincerity. Let's not doubt each other's dedication or faith. My faith is important to me, and that's why I'm here today. And that's why I'm leaving myself vulnerable and available to each of you, and laying bare my past and my beliefs and my soul in order to provide you the opportunity to meet someone who is intersex and transgender and also a Christian. It's my hope to show you how I came to my understanding and to share with you my journey from growing up and living through a series of cults and through a period of suicidal depression and finally finding my way back to a Christian faith. So here's my own story. As I mentioned, my life started through a series of cults. The first one was the family that I grew up in. I actually grew up Roman Catholic, but not in any way a traditional Catholic. There's a book going around that shows you a little bit about a relative of mine. She was my grandfather's cousin, which sort of makes her like my third or fourth cousin or something like that. Her name was Catherine Aurelia Cowett. Catherine wasn't her given name. That's the name she took when she became a Catholic nun. She, I believe it was Catherine of Siena who she really liked. And she had this really radical form of Catholicism that she followed. She believed that her personal suffering would be efficacious for the conversion of sinners, and she would constantly pray for more suffering. And consequently, suffering was a big part of my family's faith. We were expected to suffer. If you watched the Da Vinci Code and Opus and the albino who was in that film, and he would whip himself and wore a cilice, that was my aunt. She did those things. She would also burn her arms and shoulders. When she would get sick, she would pray for more suffering. In my family, we did not get sufficient medical treatment. I did not know that I had asthma. And my youngest brother has epilepsy, but according to my family, he's not really epileptic. He left the church. What he really needs is to get rid of his medications and come back to the church and have an exorcism. I should get rid of my medications for the things that are going on with me and come back to the church. That's my family. I remember a number of times not getting treatment for ear infections until my ears were bleeding. I remember getting to the doctors and having them look at my sinuses and saying, "How are you even walking?" Or at times not going to the doctors until I couldn't walk anymore. And it wasn't until around my 50s or so that I finally got diagnosed with fairly severe asthma. And now it is severe asthma, which consequently is what the woman in that little cartoon book that you're looking at died of. So it's hereditary. So suffering was a part of our family. It's what we did. We're good at it. Anyway, it would have been a great family for any dedicated Catholic, but as the firstborn, I came along to throw a bit of the intersex genetic spice into their conservative familial soup. If I'm completely honest, my family wasn't ready for me. I don't think that any cult can be ready for something that is completely outside the realm of their controlled dogma. With that said, I'll get to the first of our definitions, and that being the word cult itself. So some believe cult to be any new religious movement. In Catholic and other teaching, the word cult can be used to refer to devotion to a particular saint. So my relative, my cousin, has her own cult, or people who follow her. But how I use the word cult is any group that exerts undue influence over its members, often run by a charismatic leader, and which has certain defining characteristics that are able to highlight this influence in multiple areas of an individual's life. A gentleman by the name of Steve Hassan created something called the BITE model. And BITE is an acronym. It stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotion. So he defines a cult as groups that exert influence in those four areas. So if they control your behavior, information that you take in, your thoughts, and your emotions, then it's time to start looking at how these groups might be influencing you. There are some people who consider the MAGA movement a form of a cult. If you look at, are they controlling people's behavior? Some say they are. Are they controlling people's information input? Are they claiming, oh, that's fake media, that's fake news? Are they controlling their thoughts? Are they controlling their emotions? It's arguable that they are. So why do I call my family, or more accurately, the situation I grew up in, a cult? In part because my family permitted itself to be controlled by others. In my parents' case, it was a series of Catholic priests. From the day I was born until the day I enlisted into the Air Force, pretty much everything we did was controlled by Catholic priests. The relative whose book you're reading wanted to be under the authority of a priest, and so did my family. And where we vacationed, where I went to school, whether I went to school, I wasn't permitted to go to college. All of that was under the control of a priest. All cults have another aspect to them, and that is abuse. And in the Catholic cult that I was born into, there was that too. It was kind of like a form of television sales and marketing. But wait, there's more. Think you've had enough abuse? Wait, there's more. And like many conservative groups, it was very intolerant of difference. And that's one of the problems I encountered as a person who's intersex. So another definition, what does the word intersex mean? And what about the related term transsexual, or also transgender? Because these are terms that get people confused. Both of the words intersex and transsexual contain the word sex. So in these cases, what we're dealing with is the prefixes, intersex or inter and trans. The prefix inter means between, and the prefix trans means across. So intersex refers to someone who is between genders, or someone who may have no gender due to a genetic or medical condition. Transsexuals, therefore, refer to an individual whose physical sex is at odds with their psychological sex. And they have taken steps to bring the two into alignment medically. So they have done some sort of crossing from one to another. So again, intersex, you're somewhere between, and trans, you're crossing over. A person who is transgender is anyone on the gender spectrum who, for whatever reason, chooses not to conform with traditional gender norms via cross-dressing, surgery, hormone therapy, or simply abandoning gender norms. But there is a caveat here, and that is not to apply labels unless invited. Going up to someone you think is cross-dressing and saying, hey, I've always wanted to talk to a transgender person, may not go the way you expect. Interestingly, a person who is born with an intersex condition or raised as one sex and who recognizes that it was wrong for them can be considered transsexual or transgender, but they might not choose that term for themselves. So again, before applying labels, just wait and see how a person identifies. Get to know them first. Anyway, that's the family I grew up in. Apart from the abuse, I wasn't permitted to attend college. My godfather was willing to pay for college. That wasn't permitted. And in an attempt to fix my desire to be myself, the parish priest and my parents arranged with a recruiter, who is also a member of the church, for me to join the military under the delayed enlistment program. And so while I was still in high school, I wound up in the Army National Guard, which was a lot of fun. Eventually, I realized that being in a field artillery unit was not something that I was at all interested in. Interesting story is there, being intersex, I did not have a very masculine voice. And when it came time to tell someone to fire a 155 millimeter howitzer, I would often get yelled at for not having a masculine enough voice. It's like, I only have one voice. I can't make it sound like someone I'm not, and it was not a lot of fun. So that's what led me to my second cult. In deciding to get away from the Army, I went to visit an Air Force recruiter, which seemed a little safer, which brings us to another term called cult hopping. A lot of people who are in cults will find they leave one cult and go to another. My adopted sister was wondering why someone left one cult and went into another. And for an analogy, I will ask, why does one person leave one bad relationship and go into another? And what happens is, it's what they know. For me, what I understood is that an intense religious environment, intensity was equated with authenticity. And if a religious setting wasn't intense, it wasn't authentic. And the two were equated in my mind. So I wound up in the Air Force and I met some Mormon missionaries. And it was, again, another intense relationship with God. And I thought, well, maybe this is a place where God can fix me. What wound up happening was I had a good career in the Air Force. I won the Air Force Commendation Medal, which is basically it's the highest non-combat medal you can earn in the military. And I earned it because I was dedicated. I learned how to be dedicated in my family. And when the mission required something, I did it. And I developed a training program. I was part of NORAD. I developed a training program that became a model for our air division, and I was dedicated. So I'm going to skip ahead here for time. That dedication showed one thing, though, and that was that one of the things that we lose in cults is the ability to recognize that we need self-care. And what works great for the military does not necessarily work great for the self. And when I left the military, after, I could have had a good career, but I felt that staying in the military was not what I wanted to do. I was still more of a pacifist, but I was stuck there. But leaving the military, I moved back to New Hampshire, and I found my third cult. And I was working at a small electronics company called Dover Electronics. And the owner was part of a church, and he said, hey, our church needs someone to operate the sound system. And you can thank them. I wound up taking on that job, and the church was called The Bible Speaks. And it was run by a guy named Carl Stevens, and he also operated the Stevens School of the Bible, or Stevens Institute of the Bible. He was one of the early promoters of radio ministry. They had a bus ministry, etc. And they also managed to build an heiress of the family that owned B. Dalton Books out of about $6.5 million. And her family hired a cult deprogrammer, and she started to understand how she had been manipulated. And they filed a lawsuit and won, and the church lost that money, and they had to sell part of their property in Lenox, Massachusetts. And the whole thing actually wound up on 60 Minutes. But it was in that church that I heard a sermon that has stuck with me since. Having spoken of the abuse that I experienced, Carl once said, "If you are raped and you survive, you have sinned because you did not resist unto death." And that one burned itself into my brain. So after that church fell apart, they changed their name, took what money they had left, and bought a basically strip mall in Baltimore, Massachusetts, and changed their name to Greater Grace World Outreach. And they still continued. And Carl died, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago. But people who are still there still consider it a cult. Partly because, I mean, there were teachings like if you spoke out against Carl, you were going to get cancer of the larynx and things like that. And even back in the 1980s, he would have armed security in the church. There was another cult experience where I let myself be subjected to an exorcism. And then one final one where I wound up in a Wiccan coven that was run by someone who was a disgraced psychologist. And she'd lost her license for prescribing medications for herself. And I found myself doing things and letting go of boundaries that were just horrible. And that led me to finding my way back to Christianity. I met a friend who had grown up in a cult down here, and she opened up an art studio in New Hampshire, and we became friends. And she was the one who explained what a cult is to me. And I started sharing my own past. I had lost my job at this point. I had lost pretty much everything. I had been suicidal. I had been diagnosed as bipolar and told I couldn't work. I had multiple suicide attempts. I had committed suicide or attempted suicide 9 times at this point, and wound up in intensive care a couple of times. And this friend kind of helped me pull myself out of that. And we were sitting in her living room one day, and after sharing a number of things, and she said, "It's okay, I grew up in a cult too." And that word "too" hit me really hard. And it was she and her family who helped me find an organization called the International Cultic Studies Association, and they helped me find a therapist. And one of these therapists had me write a poem about confidence, because confidence was something I was severely lacking. And the only way I could find confidence was through this friend of mine. So I wrote this poem called Confidence. And it reads, "I don't know you, but we chat for a moment, and one chat leads to another, and we become slowly, ever so slowly, friends. Trust is not given easily. As friendship and trust grow, we share simple things at first, and art and music and humor. And I find joy when I can help you through your pain. And suddenly, I am now in pain, and it is you helping me. And I now see that there is a sisterhood of compassion of we who have known this secret pain. And we find confidence to face each next day because we are not alone." So for a while, this sister and I were living with each other, and I learned a lot about life. I was there to help take care of her mom with the rest of her family at the end of her life. And I had the opportunity to learn then that I could be a good daughter. even if my own family couldn't recognize me as daughter. And for people who are trans and intersex who choose to live their own identity rather than what was assigned to them at birth, this insult, not recognizing us for who we are, that's among the most painful. It's when our identities aren't acknowledged by those we love, by those who we expect to love us. That's when that depression and desperation lead us to want to take our own lives. And it was this, again, as I mentioned, this family who helped me find the organizations that helped me find my own healing. And since I've been here, I've found other people like that. And I found that same healing in this community. And it was also at this point at my mom's death that I learned for certain that I'd been shunned officially by my family. I wasn't even allowed my own name in my mom's obituary. So now that's my abbreviated history, and that's what conservative and cult-like families do to a person. And that's not the conservatism that existed in the 1970s. It's not the conservatism of Nixon or of Reagan or of other people from back then. It's not the conservatism that labeled LGBTQI people as groomers. It's not the conservatism that labeled Democrats as threats to women and children. That's something new. It's not the conservatism that labeled anybody who was pro-abortion as somehow pro-death. So here's the problem. We've become a nation that wants to see everything as binary when everything is actually bimodal. So let's look at genetic sex. When I was born, some doctor said it's a boy, and it wasn't. It was someone who had XY chromosomes, but it was also someone who had something called estrogen resistance syndrome, a condition that the body doesn't necessarily know what to do with sex hormones. But when it comes to genetic sex, there are 6 relatively common sex karyotypes. We've got XX, XY, XXY, XXX, XXXY. We've got a whole bunch of things going on. We also have things like androgen insensitivity syndrome, partial androgen insensitivity syndrome, chimerism, and a bunch of other things. And at this point, I also want to bring up something about genetic men in women's sports, because that's the hot topic today. And I want to ask you something. There's about 510,000 people, men and women, in the NCAA. 230,000 of them are women. So we're going to play a game. Out of those 510,000 athletes, we're going to guess how many of those are actually trans. So we're going to do percentages. So option 1, would it be between 25,000 and 250,000? How many of you would think it would be? We're going to have 5 bins. So that would be between 5% and 50%. How many people would think between 5% and 50% are trans? Okay, option 2, 0.5% to 5%. That would be 2,501 to 2,500 out of 510,000. How many people would think it's there? Okay, option 3, 0.05% to 0.5%. That would be 251 to 2,500 athletes. Anyone go for that number? Okay. Option 4 is between 26 to 250 athletes. That would be between 0.05% to 0.5%. Anyone go for that number? Okay. And lastly, to make it an ABCDE test, we'll divide that option by 2. And and say less than 13 or 0.0025%. And actually the number is lower than that. There were fewer than 10 trans athletes in the entirety of the NCAA. And that's where we're at. This is the crisis that they're trying to avoid in the NCAA right now. And this is what we're passing laws against. And these are women who largely have not come in first place in any of these competitions. This idea that women are losing and being pushed out of sports is non-existent. So listening to many Christians regarding conditions like this, I've heard these things happen because sin entered the world. And in that case, I'm reminded of chapter 9 in the Gospel of John, when a man was born blind and was seen by Jesus, and one of his disciples said, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." And that's what I think is happening to people like me. Nobody sinned. I'm not a result of sin. I am this way because God wants to show something in me. And that's why we're all like this. And what happened? Jesus spit on the ground and put mud in his eyes so that God could show forth his glory. Gospel of Matthew, Jesus spoke of eunuchs. Eunuchs were the trans people of the day. They were born that way. Why? So God could show his glory. There's nothing in the Bible that speaks to Christians becoming eunuchs for the sake of God, except for, Jesus said, yeah, they're going to glorify me. It wasn't a matter of sin. Then people point out in Paul's letter to the Romans all of these sins that people find worthy of death. And that was in the first chapter of Romans. Then you go to the second chapter of Romans, and Paul is saying, you know what? Every one of you are doing the exact same things. And then you find I believe it's in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and he's saying, it's not works that get you to heaven. It's not being good. It's grace that gets you to heaven. So all of these cases, I'm going to close with this. My 8th great-grandfather was the foreman of the jury for the last of the Salem witch trials. And people were sentenced to death. And shortly before that, we had Quakers in Boston who were sentenced to death. So first we had the Quakers being sentenced to death. We had the witches being sentenced to death. After the witch trials were over and it was proved a hoax, a number of the jurors who had sentenced these people to death apologized, saying this was wrong. My ancestor was not one of them. This was a Harvard-educated Puritan preacher. And that's the hatred and the religious zealotry that has permeated my family for centuries. But today, we still have our witches. Today, they aren't witches. They're the LGBTQI community. They're the people who were accused of Satanism in the 80s and 90s. They're just the current round of people that conservatives can point to and say, this is where we need to focus. And they're the scapegoats. They're the ones to point at so that we are going to fight amongst ourselves rather than sticking together and saying, let's find love in this world. Let's find joy. Let's find beauty. And that's what we really need to look for. Anyway, I tried to make it short. I hope, if you guys have any questions, please ask. Ty.
How did you find us?
What's that?
How did you find us?
So, the family that adopted me one of the daughters, Wendy, had actually been a member of this meeting. And I knew that when I was looking for a church in the area. And I said, you know, I'm going to check out this meeting. And I came here and I got stuck. And y'all wouldn't let me go.
It's that sound system.
It is. It is.
How do you know that this isn't just the next one?
Yeah.
That this isn't the next cult? Because every other religious group that I've been a part of told me what to believe. This group does not. This group tells me to discover what I believe. And that's the difference. It's a daunting thing. You are, as a Quaker, responsible for everything that you believe, and you're responsible to everything that you believe. And that's a very different paradigm.
So, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So, Dee, this is Clarence Reed. I love having you as part of our family. I love your journey, and I love you.
I love you more than you know. Thank you.
What was Wendy's last name?
Gavel. Yes. Now you understand. Oh, you're welcome. Go ahead.
What advice would you give to someone who's also LGBT and who's also involved in, theology, and speaking to other people to validate our place in the religious community?
So, do a lot of reading and research. One of the points that I didn't make involves religious or biblical interpretation. So there's a lot of times where people will say, oh, a plain reading of the text says this. So we look at stories like Sodom and Gomorrah, and Sodom has become so ingrained that, you know, we hear like, you know, we have the crime of sodomy. And I would ask, what exactly was the sin of Sodom? And what's interesting is that the sin of Sodom was not homosexuality. And that becomes plain, you know, in the book of Ezekiel, where it looks like you understand this.
I've studied a lot of American.
Right. So for people who don't know, in Ezekiel, is that 16:49? Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, and on and on and on. But also, when you're studying the Bible, is to look at who was speaking, who were they speaking to, etc., etc. Was the sin actual homosexuality or cross-dressing, or was it referring to temple prostitution or something similar? Were they referring to pagan rites instead of just homosexuality? Was Paul speaking for God, or was Paul speaking out of his own manhood as a Roman soldier and things like that? Were they speaking things that were cultural, or were they speaking things that were religious? And it makes things not quite as clear as a, quote, plain reading of the text would have most people believe. I had to do some technical translation from Danish to English in a prior job. Technical translation is really easy because words have one meaning. But I also grew up speaking another language. English was not my first language. And when you try to go just from one language to another, things get muddy. But when you go from 3,000 years ago to today, things get a lot more complicated. So just trying to say, oh, just read it, just read the plain reading. Try going to the plain reading word for word from ancient Hebrew. It's not going to even look like anything you're going to understand. There's a lot of interpretation. And I would have people try to understand that the plain reading of the text, there is no such thing.
I hope that helps.
No, that helps a lot. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thanks so much for coming out.